What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Nick and I returned this week for a full NFL draft mailbag. We've been waiting to do one of these, excited about it. We received a plethora of fantastic questions from you guys on Twitter. We really appreciate that, a lot of which are Steelers related or have Steelers related tie-ins. So much so that it was honestly like kind of difficult for us to kind of sort through all the different questions that we got to pick out our favorite ones. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. If I didn't get to your question on this episode, I'll try to go back and at least respond to you on Twitter or maybe use those in like future podcasts, things like that. But I'm really excited to dive into this thing. I know you are as well. Now that we are in full off-season mode, we are a week away from the NFL Combine. Excited about that. But first, how you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great, man. Like you said, we're past the Super Bowl. We're all into draft time at this time of the year, man. It's full swing every single day, getting into the film, and I enjoy this process a lot, and can't wait for the combine. Can't wait to keep getting to all these prospects that have not even gotten to yet. Like it's always fun just getting into it.
Yeah, I mean, for as much as like I love like the schematic element of football, like the X's and O's, like learning more about all that stuff, the team building process is like easily my favorite. Like it's part of the
Yes.
reason why I fell in love with the NFL draft and even like trying to dive more into like free agency in recent years and things like that. It's just so much fun. But again, just before we get things kicked off, if you guys don't mind, press that like button for me, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. As always, drop us your questions, feedback in the comments. I really appreciate all of those things. It helps the channel continuously grow. Just a quick reminder for those interested in the NFL draft prospect film rooms. Last week, I dropped one on Jackson Dart, Ole Miss quarterback, who we will discuss at some point during the podcast today. We're going to flip sides of the ball. We're actually going to look at defensive end Walter Nolan, a guy that's been mocked quite a bit, I feel like, to the Steelers recently. I'm going to look at him this week in the film room. So the link to become a channel member is in the description of this video. Without further ado, let's get started. So first question is actually going to be from C. Smitty. Have you guys watched South Carolina's Nick Emenwari? I think he'd be a phenomenal slot option. Nick, what are your thoughts on Emenwari?
So Eamon Worry was one of the first guys I marked going into the draft process because I was watching Ricky Pearsall play against South Carolina, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember I was just like, "Who is this large safety that is just mirroring him perfectly, just constantly in phase with him vertically?" And I look him up, and I'm like, "Oh, of course, he's a Bruce Feldman freaks list guy with a 42-inch vertical," and and you just watch him. It's not like some people might get like reminders of like past like freakish safeties like this guy who were like didn't end up panning out in the NFL because they didn't really
Mm-hmm.
have a position like Isaiah Simmons or Obi Melifonwu. Um, Emin Worry is not that type of player. He can play literally like all over. It's not just a matter of like you don't know how to play him, so you just play him everywhere. He can match guys in man to man pretty well, especially in like zone coverages from like off alignments. There's no wasted steps. Like when he's breaking on the ball, it's really impressive just seeing that type of explosive click and close drive from someone so big. You watch him play though, and like I don't really know if he's a fit for the Steelers because like they found if this was last year, I would have said that this would have been a player that they should have been all over. But we came
Yep.
in the season, Deshaun Elliott played out of his mind. He showed a lot of stuff, like just being able to play all over in the box, play in the slot at times. I really think they found something that really worked for them next to Minka Fitzpatrick. So Nick Worry, as much as like I like him as a prospect, and I'm very excited about like his ability at the next level, potentially could be like the next Derwin James type of player. I mean, I watched him play on Luther Burden like a couple times this year. He made some unbelievable tackles on him in space, and Burden is not an easy guy to get on the ground. Like he drives his hips into every tackle, and it's just so beautiful to watch. Um, but yeah, Eamon Worry, don't really think he's a guy that's going to be on the Steelers' radar, but he's a guy that we did not put in our first round mock draft that I was really bummed about because I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't know where to fit him. But like he's that type of player, he's that type of prospect. Big fan of his game.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned just like some of the comps that he's getting. I have heard that, he kind of models his game after Derwin James. Derwin was one of my favorite prospects really of all time, I love Derwin James coming out of Florida State. And I think like Derwin has been a fantastic NFL player when he's actually been healthy. You mentioned some of the things about Eman Wari that you like in terms of just the way that he's built. He's 227 pounds. In the Feldman's Freak List article, I read that he was clocked at 23 miles per hour.
Yeah.
The acceleration in the burst that he plays with is awesome. I think that there is a ton of upside for him as like a hook curl defender. There are some really encouraging moments of him like driving on intermediate throws. You mentioned some of the work and like man coverage and things like that. Because he's so long and he's so physical, he can also like get up and constrict space with guys and kind of knock them off their routes because he's so strong. And I do like the 42-inch vertical, man. Like that shows up on tape. Like some of the interceptions that he's had. I think back to, I think it was 2 years ago, he ended up mossing, I think, a receiver. I think it was the Clemson game. He went up and like high pointed the football and had this like incredible one-handed interception. He also had one, I think, against Kentucky 2 years ago. That was a similar thing, like high pointing the football, going up and getting it. I'll tell you what the thing I like most about Eman Wari, though. It's one, he's big, and I've already went kind of down this rant that like I hate when players are built like freaks, but they don't necessarily play like it. It's kind of like they're built like Tarzan, but they play like Jane type of old analogy. Eman Wari, to me, the way he plays is one of those guys that I think could really change the complexion of an NFL defense because when he hits guys, guys go backwards. And I like that. He's a reliable tackler. You look at his missed tackle rate and things like that. He's reliable in that regard. But when you talk about somebody that will trigger, he will aggressively fit the run. He will play off blocks. But I just like there are some times on film where he's like coming out of the screen to make tackles. And instead of just getting guys on the ground, he's like driving them backwards and into the turf. And I just really appreciate that. And I think like it kind of does go back to a little bit to the Super Bowl thing that we just watched last week when it was Chiefs and the Eagles. Man, every time Philly was on the field, I just felt like it felt like they were playing with 15 guys. The tenacity that they were playing with, the physicality, not just against block, but in the open field and tackles and eliminating those yards after the catch. So I do think Eman Wari has a lot of upside in that regard. The one thing that I will say about him is his height does make some of his reps in space a little bit more, I would say, like clunky than I would like personally. Some of the split field stuff in terms of like him having a drive from depth is oftentimes, it just looks a little bit weird because like when he's in a back pedal, he plays a little bit high. And I think that sometimes prohibits him from like closing on things as quickly as maybe his athleticism would allow him to if he just played a little bit lower and a little bit more consistent with his footwork. But there's a lot of potential here. I don't necessarily know if I see him as like a full-time slot. I'm more of see him as like kind of a box safety that could play in the nickel. But he's a really interesting piece. Right. He's one of those guys that I'm just really excited to see like where he goes, just to see which defensive coordinator can, unlock this type of physical specimen. So kind of next thing here we wanted to go to, I got Chop coming in with a heater here. He says, are there any of your favorite wide receivers or cornerbacks that aren't getting much hype? So I kind of took this as like maybe guys outside the top 50. That's the way I was kind of processing this question, get guys outside the top 50. So that kind of excludes Florida State's Azareye'h Thomas, who like I feel like I mention every week on this podcast as a guy who like I am higher on than the consensus and like who I would take a lot earlier than the top 50. But do you have any? I have a corner in mind for this question. Do you have a wide receiver or a corner that you want to give a shout here?
I have a wide receiver. I was actually a pretty big fan of Torrey Horton back in last year's draft process. And
I remember that.
He ended up surprisingly going back to school. I was really shocked about that. He ends up going back and ends up not being a good move for him because he ends up getting hurt. He has an injury riddled season. He's not able to play. And we're still kind of like, figuring out the medicals on that end. But he was a player with legitimate 4.3 speed who could take the top off of defense with his vertical game breaking ability. He also had like surprising high point ability for someone who was built like as like wiry as he is, because he's like listed around like 6'3", 185. I would say he's closer to like 6'1", just based off like what I've seen from his build. Like I don't think he's quite 6'3", but he's got that vertical game breaking ability. He can sit in the chair really well on stopping routes. I was really impressed with that, but it's just a matter of like, he's hurt. So we kind of just have to wait on the medicals. He's someone I could see being like a value later in the draft. the Nevada had a really like promising offense like years ago with like Romeo Dobbs, Torrey Horton, and I'm sure people remember it
Yeah.
was Carson Strong, I believe, a quarterback who
Yep.
had some paper mache knees, as far as I'm concerned.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yep, very unfortunately. But Horton was that vertical game breaking guy, and he transfers to Colorado State, really becomes like the guy for them. Has like an excellent game against Colorado the year in 2023, like against Travis Hunter, like really impressed on a national stage, showing like the ability to keep his feet in bounds along the sideline, high pointing a football, vertical game breaking ability. I just think he's a guy who's being undervalued at this point just because of the unfortunate circumstances regarding his injury.
Yeah, I mean, he had what it was like 1,100 yards, I think, the year before he got hurt. So yeah, I mean, that's a good shout. Somebody that's I think consensus pretty much has him in the day 3 round territory. Medicals are going to be huge for him. That's a big part of the combine that's coming up next week. We'll get a lot more clarity on in terms of like how the NFL views these guys, what the medicals look like. The guy that I really wanted to shout out here at corner was another was an undersized guy a little bit, but it's Jacob Parrish from Kansas State. I'm not sure if you've had the chance to watch him, but
I
he's a guy
haven't.
I think's gonna he's a guy that who I think's gonna end up going on day 2 of the draft, man. You look at him, he's a 3-year contributor, but a 2-year starter, early declare. Most of his playing time actually comes out on the boundary, so he played outside corner last year for them, but I actually like him a little bit more in the slot. He is a dude who literally punches above his weight. This dude's really physical. He'll press. He likes to mix in like 2-hand jams, knock guys off the line of scrimmage. He's shown that he's a pretty willing tackler. He flies downhill in terms of like when he's in like cover 2 zones or defending the screen game, things like that. He will come flying downhill with urgency and make tackles in the backfield. That's a really key responsibility for like things that I look forward to projecting guys into the slot, because you're going to have to play the run. You're going to have to take care of the flat area, things like that. But he's got a lot of man coverage experience on film, and that's one of the things that I like. He's really fluid in his hips. He's a little bit undersized, so you kind of hope for that skill set. But he's got pretty fluid hips. He's sticky in coverage, man. He had 4 picks, I think, as a sophomore. His only interception this past year, I think, was in the red zone area, where he's defending I think it's against Oklahoma State, but he's playing a mirror technique, and they're running a fade to his direction, and he ends up squeezing this guy to the boundary, kind of flipping, getting his head back around, locating the football, and then boxes a bigger receiver out to come away with an interception. So I do think his like physicality can sometimes tread on that line of being too aggressive. I'm not actually sure. I forgot to write down like how many penalties he actually had, but there was a little bit of grabbiness sometimes. And then I don't think like the long recovery speed is necessarily a strength for him, but I do think like he can find a home in the slot and potentially be a starting caliber slot corner early on, like during his rookie contract. So I do think he gives you some versatility on the outside, but I like him better on the inside. He's somebody that I currently have like a round 3 grade on, and he's someone that I would take a chance on day 2, especially, Pittsburgh runs a lot of man coverage, probably going to need a slot corner at some portion of the draft too. I've already kind of mentioned just how fond I am of the depth of the cornerback class. I think you're going to be able to find contributors into the 3rd, 4th, 5th round of this draft. And Parrish is just kind of one of those guys.
Yeah, you mentioned Jacob Parrish. I have not gotten to his tape, so um, would you, just for like a comparison's sake, like going into his film, like what type of
Mm-hmm.
player like would you say he's like comparable to that plays 2 in the NFL like right now that like you'd say like is a pretty good like benchmark for him?
Man, it's kind of tough for him because, like I said, he did play so much like outside, but I'm kind of projecting him more to the slot. I don't have a true comparison off the top of my head. I do. The thing I like about him, man, is like he's really competitive, and I like that, especially if you're
Yeah.
talking about putting a guy inside, knowing the different responsibilities that are going to be on your plate in that. But I just like the sticky man coverage ability. I'm not sure I have like a comparison though, but there's a lot to like with his game, and someone that I think like Pittsburgh will at least like be somewhat interested in. He's also going to be a 21-year-old rookie, I believe. So like he is like I said, underclassman that declared early. So he's got some upside there for sure. I know a lot of people have been talking about like potentially maybe an off the wall type of selection for Jahdae Barron. In terms of if the Steelers were to go a slot early, maybe in the 1st, 2nd round, Jahdae Barron being a guy that I think has a lot of fans in the draft community. I like him as well, but Parrish would be a pretty solid like consolation prize in my opinion. So kind of going on to the next one here. This one's from Z. With the combination of free agency and the NFL draft, how would you attack? I was saying he's saying there, but I think he's talking about the Steelers. How would you attack their needs? Would you grab a cornerback in free agency, a running back in the middle of the draft, et cetera, et cetera? I think this could be, kind of interpreted a couple different ways, but I'll kind of give you the floor first on what you think here.
So for me, I really think cornerback maybe has more versatility in terms of free agency. If you wanted to go out and attack it, like say if you want to go for like an Asante Samuel Jr. who has like that
Mm-hmm.
inside and outside versatility to be able to play, in a pinch. Like let's say if the Steelers are going to rely on Corey Trice for say, like let's say they're showing a lot of faith in him, and let's say the injuries still continue to be a problem, they need that guy who can be able to not just play in the slot, but can like go outside if things really, hit the fan. And I really think that like someone like Samuel is something that they should do to attack that. In terms of like free agency with wide receivers, it's not a very good pool of unrestricted free agents. Like I don't like there are guys like T Higgins, but like we're not gonna get this nice of names in Pittsburgh. I don't believe. And
Yep.
I don't know if you want to like go after Demarcus Robinson as like a 30-year-old wide receiver, that
Mm-hmm.
like gives them reliable hands. But in terms of receivers, the only guy in free agency that really even comes to mind is Chris Godwin. And it's really funny because like a couple of years ago, they had like back in 2017, they had the chance to draft him. They ended up taking
Yep.
Juju Smith-Schuster, who had a good career, but it was more short-lived in terms of his overall
Yep.
prime. And Godwin, yeah, he's had some unfortunate injuries down the stretch, but he's been more of a long-term, type of player. He's
Yep.
definitely that type of guy that they need in the slot in terms of just being able to fill that role in terms of both blocking, being dependable over the middle of the field. Those are the types of like free agent acquisitions that can
Mm-hmm.
move those needs down the line. And I think that can definitely work out for you because wide receiver, I don't think it's necessarily deep this year. I think it's more of like you might have to get your guy at the top, even if you don't like it. Similar to like
Yep.
the 2022, no, it was the 23 wide receiver class with Jackson Smith and Jigba and Jordan Addison. Like, you like those guys, but you didn't necessarily want to take them in the first round per se. And like
Mm-hmm.
those picks have worked out for those teams. They've ended up being good players, but they weren't like exactly like marquee type of talents. And I think, guys like Matthew Golden would make a lot of sense to take earlier than say like, waiting on a receiver that you're not as comfortable taking in a class that just doesn't really have a ton of names. So
Yep.
I'm kind of split. I think they should attack corner more in free agency than anything else. Running back, they could attack it just basically anywhere in the NFL draft. So I'm really not worried about them finding the guy to play next to Jalen Warren and be more of a fit in an outside zone scheme.
Yeah, this was kind of difficult because not to spoil like some content that's coming on the channel in terms of like the free agency previews, but you look at the guys in the free agency pool among the corners. You got guys like Carlton Davis, guys like Tavarius Ward that are longer corners, have press man experience, can kind of fit the mold and be like kind of the opposite of what Joey Porter is on the other side. It gives you two guys that can play at the line of scrimmage, but those guys are also 29, 30 years old. So, and corner is a position that once you get up into that like third contract range, you're really getting pretty ballsy in terms of risking those guys falling off a cliff athletically because it's a very, very much a young man's position out there in space. So I think that's kind of tough. I mean, there are other options. Like you mentioned, Asante Samuel, the guy who took Samuel's spot with him being injured this year in LA, guy like Christian Fulton, he kind of capitalized on a prove it deal with LA. I think he's going to get a little bit more money. I think probably the highest earner at the corner spot is probably going to end up being Byron Murphy just because he's like a year or two younger than the first couple guys that I've mentioned. Who knows what his status is going to be in Minnesota. But yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, because back when we did the first podcast and we talked about the top 5 needs for Pittsburgh, and I mentioned that like outside corner and slot corner were both inside my top 5 needs, just of what I wanted them to address. Maybe you could go get a cheaper slot corner and then address outside corner in the draft. So like an example would be like going and get Nate Hobbs, who has a connection with Gerald Alexander, who they just brought over as their defensive backs coach. That would make a little bit of sense to me. as well. And there's some other slot corners that could potentially be available on the inside too. So I think that would kind of be my approach. Just in terms of addressing other needs, I'm not as big of a fan on the depth of the wide receiver class or this wide receiver class in general. So it is like one of those things where you may have to, prioritize knocking that out and maybe waiting a little bit on some other positions as well. But those would be kind of be the things. The running back position is not something that I would even look at addressing in free agency. Like I've kind of combed through those names, and there's just nothing really there that really interests me a ton. But this running back draft class is so good to where you can go get where guys like Devin Neal from Kansas, Virginia Tech's Bayshaw Tootin are going to be available potentially into like the day 3 of the draft, which I think is crazy. That can come in and like take carries from day 1. So those are kind of my thoughts on like how to address the needs. Kind of the next question here is actually a really good one. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this dude's name, so I'm just going to refer to him as GM. But what skill sets should the Steelers be looking for in their next cornerback or defensive tackle? Because this is such a good question, I have a very long-winded answer, so bear with me. But this is honestly like really good stuff here. But for me, it just comes down to scheme. So when I'm thinking about corners, I'm looking at like what situation they're going to be operating within. So Pittsburgh runs man coverage at the 6th highest rate, but they're also 4th lowest in disguise rate. So when you're talking about operating out there on the boundary, you're going to be pretty much on an island with quarterbacks having pre-snap indicators on where they're going to be able to attack their one-on-ones, right? So recently we've seen the team kind of gravitate more towards these longer corners. We talked about Corey Trice just a minute ago, Joey Porter Jr., height, weight, length guys through the draft. But then they traded for Dante Jackson, who's basically the antithesis of that. So it does kind of tell me a little bit that those are more maybe preferences than requirements. So for me, what I would be looking for is someone that I can trust in man coverage, whether that's press or off, the ability, willingness to tackle. I just think that is such an important part of today's NFL, whether it's on the boundary or in the slot. And then instincts in terms of anticipating throws, end zone coverage, having urgency to drive on throws, but also the comfortability of playing the football through the air. Kind of talking about defensive line, this isn't a system that likes to blitz a lot. So especially on like 3rd down, they really like to get that 4-man and go type of pass rush. So they want to allocate more of their resources to coverage than anything else. So the shorter kind of fire hydrant types builds, those are normally off the table for Pittsburgh. We don't really see those designated pass rushers inside make their way here. They have drafted some other guys like Leal and Loudermilk kind of come to mind in terms of like taller, leaner guys that they like to just try to bulk up. The success of those guys could be debated. Not great there, right? But they're mid-round picks, so it just is what it is. But normally they like guys with 32-inch arms. But I think the thing that I come back to is like if you can't play the run or be some sort of factor there, you're just not going to play in Pittsburgh. They're not going to put you on the field. So for me, I'd be looking for a player that has a translatable way to win as a pass rusher, whether that's finesse, whether it's power, speed, maybe a little bit less applicable here, and then someone who is reliable at the point of attack. In terms of run defense, Benton and Ogajobi, both those guys can make plays in the backfield, make plays away from their gap because of their range, but they are guys who can get washed down versus doubles, gaps, keep stuff, things like that. So that's kind of my long-winded answer in terms of like what the Steelers look for, and then some of the things that I would be looking for if they're going to attack those 2 positions in the draft. What about you?
So you mentioned the length. I think that's always like a huge aspect that like Pittsburgh looks for, especially with like when they're going after like like defensive linemen who can 2-gap more effectively, because being able to maintain the line of scrimmage, typically that length helps you be able to get from one gap to the other, holding that line of scrimmage. When it comes to the Steelers, they kind of they're more of like a hybrid type of defense. They're not a 3-4 and they're not a 4-3. They play a lot of mixture of the two. So they ask a lot from their defensive tackles, like almost an obscene amount. Like what they ask Hayward to do just in the screen, like in the screen game alone, like there's so much effort. There's so much like motor to their defensive linemen. And I really think that's one of the key things they really look for in a lot of their guys is, can you make an impact just outside of where you're normally asked to, make those plays? Like, do you make the hustle plays down the field? Are you going to make those types of big plays in those regards? Because like I was watching Notre Dame defensive tackle Riley Mills, and I saw him making a couple plays out in space in terms of snuffing out screens, and I was like, this is the type of guy that like Pittsburgh could be interested in because they like that type of motor. They like those, guys who can really pass rush. And I really think Mills was that type of guy that was like impressing me in that regard. They also ask a ton, like just of their defensive tackles in the run game. And I think Keanu Benton has come up short in that regard so far. And a lot of it just has to do with, I think, how he plays. He plays much more of a finesse style than an overall power style. And it's not that he lacks power, it's that he doesn't use it as his go-to. And I think that's one of the things that's been different. Pittsburgh likes a lot of power rushers. They want to be able to push the
Yep.
pocket, not necessarily be able to get around those guys. But
Yeah.
I really think like the answer is just multi-dimensional. Like they need like guys who can do it all. They ask so much of their defensive linemen. So I'm in the same
Yeah.
boat as you in regards to what they ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think we mentioned the length thing. It's usually guys with like 32-inch arms, right? Like that's kind of what you want. Those levers kind of help you establish that first significant contact, generate that knockback, hold the point of attack, things like that. And then you mentioned the hustle. That's a great shout because that's another thing I mentioned. Like if you don't have any interest in playing the run, or you just flat out can't, they just won't play you for real. And that's another thing that I think is like non-negotiable for a Mike Tomlin defense for all of the things that they didn't do well down the stretch last season, or maybe some of their shortcomings and big moments in the past couple of years. The one thing that you can always count on in Pittsburgh is that the guys are going to play hard, and like that really starts at the top. Because I think about like some of their best players and the way that they have like this maniacal, fantastic effort on a play-to-play basis. Cam Hayward, TJ Watt, that's the standard on defense. So if you're a guy that's gonna like on film, anytime I see a player, and there's like two that come to mind right now that get mocked inside the top 50, and it drives me insane. But there's like two players in particular, like in the front seven, that people will talk about potential Steelers fits. And I'm like, have you guys seen this dude play? Like he takes multiple plays, not just plays, but drives off. Like they're not even going to look at this dude. So
yeah,
those are some of the things that I would, keep an eye on in terms of like, if you're considering like mock drafting, guys there. But of course, we couldn't go a full episode without discussing this polarizing quarterback class. I don't think we'll have to go too deep into this one, but we do want to hit on it. This question is from Anthony. He said, Jackson Dart in round 1 or Jalen Milroe in round 2. Nick, what is your answer?
For me, this is just a matter of, would I rather take a quarterback in round 1 of this year's draft, or would I rather take literally anything else later on and take much less risk? I'm taking much less risk in this class every single time. Now, I'm abstaining from most of my thoughts on Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward for right now. I will get to them at a different time. But in regards to Jackson Dart, I just don't really understand the first round hype. I do think his arm is a little bit slightly underrated by the NFL community at large. I think there's a lot of like people who think he doesn't have that drive velocity. I think that's a little misstated. I think he has some pretty decent arm talent. The problem with him is, again, he plays in an Ole Miss scheme that sometimes borders on the Art Briles of, in terms of being able to spread out and just make these unbelievable windows that are just like super wide open in the middle of the field that just aren't going to happen. You're not going to get that much space. You aren't going to like allow like linebackers to be like all the way out like on the boundary in these types of scenarios. Like that's one of the things that like everyone talks about the Duke game with him, and I'm just like, that middle of the field was just a chasm. Like
Yeah.
there's no one there. There's no hook defender. Like I certainly hope you can make those throws. And in regards to Jalen Milroe, I'll keep my thoughts a little bit short because I have a bit more nuanced on this, but I think he is a guy, in terms of conceptually, he has a lot of great ideas. It's just his arm doesn't always cash it in regards to his mechanics and, his ability to just like, sometimes hit the open throw. There's a lot of misses on film, but you can see his eyes end up in the right spots. So it's common to ask this, but like process over results is how I tend to be. And there are sometimes cases where the results just matter more. With Jackson Dart, I just think there's a lot less that he's being asked. I think he struggled with the things that he was being asked during the Senior Bowl, in terms of just like the verbiage and, a lot of the stuff that you're going to have to do in terms of controlling the line of scrimmage, making protection calls. Not even Jalen Hurts, did that early on in his career in Philadelphia. It was up to Kelsey to do a lot of that, and it took him a while. Once he got used to it, like it takes time to do those types of things, and a lot of
Yeah.
quarterbacks are asked to do those. And I just don't really think Dart is the type of quarterback that I personally feel comfortable taking a risk on in the first round. I just don't
Yeah.
believe that his development path tells me that it's going to happen fast enough for me to warrant that risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because, like you mentioned, the Senior Bowl. I don't think either guy had very good weeks at all. I think Dart was better than Milroe was in that setting, but I mean, you predictably saw both of them struggle in different areas. Dart, I mean, they asked him to get under center, and like he bobbled a couple snaps just because like it's not really something that he's done. And then like Milroe, like you could tell visibly, like even if you've never watched him play, you could tell like someone, whoever he's working with, quarterback coach wise leading up to the draft, they are trying to rewire him from the ground up in terms of like his mechanics, his lower body
Yes.
mechanics, his drop, his footwork. And like you can just tell he's going through those like 7-on-7 drills, which should be easy for quarterbacks. He's going through them, okay, like let me set my feet, let me get my weight balance right, and all those things where it's like that's not really the setting that I would have probably chose to do that, but that's what ultimately ended up happening. You know, I did the
Mhm.
film room on Dart. I'll just keep my thoughts like really short and simple here. There are things that I do like. I think he's competitive as heck. I think he's tough as nails in terms of like willing to take contact both as a runner and hang into the pocket. I like the way he will push the ball down the field. That's something that I like. I do enjoy watching him play from time to time, depending on the game more so. I think he throws with fantastic touch. Over the middle of the field. I think the accuracy is mostly good from the first and second levels. I think the touch throws, understanding when to take some heat off, layering footballs over linebackers, things like that. I do think that he does those things well. Now, in terms of, I got so excited here, I knocked my mic over, but in terms of like things that I don't see on film, we kind of do differ in terms of like the way we see his arm. I do think he has some arm talent. I am not very bullish on like the velocity that he throws with. Some of that lower body related, though. There are
Yes.
times where he will lock out his front foot, which causes the ball to die on him. That's where his accuracy does wane some. I do think that he has the ability to throw on the run. I like that. There are some, like I said, the touch throws are awesome. I just don't necessarily think he has the arm to kind of cash how often he is late to things in the progression. You mentioned
Agreed.
the space thing. That offense, it just creates so much space. I mean, these throwing windows are wide open in terms of how often he's throwing to like one-on-one matchups down the field and things like that. It's just not how the NFL is. And you know, I went through the better part of I think about 7 or 8 games of his film. I saw him get through a full field read progression one time to where he went 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and got to like the backside dig on something. It's just like I'm not expecting you to do that every series or even like maybe once a game, but the fact that there were opportunities available and like he was instead like taking sacks when he was actually asked to do more full field read stuff was just worrisome to me. I just think he's further away, and I just kind of question like the upside, like because I'm not maybe as bullish on the arm talent as maybe as like other people are, and I think he's an above average like solid athlete, but is he going to be like a guy you design runs for? Is he going to be that type of player? I don't know. So I don't know. I just think he's further away than other people maybe think. So that's kind of for me. Like I'm all the way out on the first 2 rounds, like 100%. I mean, you could maybe convince me in the 3rd round, but that's really where the conversation starts. I feel like
Agreed.
we've talked about Milroe more, but in terms of just there are things that you like about Milroe's game, and there are things that are just so bad about his game that need to be completely rebuilt. Like he could throw the ball down the field. As a quarterback, I think that obviously what he can do as a runner, he's electric. There are some teams out there that are probably already thinking of ways they could design quarterback run packages with him in the game, with the read option stuff, the power run, the acceleration that he has in a straight line is absurd. Like I go back to the Georgia game this past year, he looked like the best athlete on the field. And Georgia's got I don't know how many draft picks probably playing on that defense. He was outrunning everybody. So I mean, the fact that
Yes.
he could do those things is pretty special. You see the upside with him. The downside is that the lows on his film are catastrophically low to the point where like he looks borderline unplayable. And if that's the case at college, what are things going to look like at the NFL level where he's going up against guys that can match his athleticism a little bit more, and also everything's going to be quicker and require him to work faster in the pocket. So it's a scary quarterback class, man. We keep saying like this isn't the year, but I know there's always a chance that Pittsburgh could go that direction. And I understand that, without a long-term or even really a short-term solution right now on the roster, I understand that we have to talk about these guys. It's just that they come with a significant amount of risk. And that's the only thing I'll say about that. But kind of moving on to the next question here, assuming the Steelers sign one wide receiver in free agency, would that change their draft strategy and taking a guy in the first round? I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. I do have some thoughts. I'll let you kind of go first here.
I think we kind of like already addressed this in terms of like the free agents. Like, I don't really see the wide receiver free agency class as anything like that I would personally feel good about in terms of like
Sure.
realism. Like, I don't think T Higgins is coming to Pittsburgh, but if someone asked me if like Chris Godwin came to Pittsburgh, would that change like your perspective on taking a wide receiver in the first round? I'd say absolutely, because
Yeah.
they need that type of receiver. And I think Godwin brings a lot of the things in terms of just veteran dependability, his ability to get open. Obviously, there's going to be the concerns with the injuries. You don't want to
Sure.
completely, fall yourself out of wide receiver, but it definitely reshuffles everything. It allows you to potentially wait on it. Even if you're not as big on the wide receiver class, there's obviously going to be some guys that you can find later in the draft. Like I said, Torrey Horton was someone. I'm interested
Role
in Kanate
players.
Mumfield out of Pitt. I still have I have high hopes for him. I'm really hoping he comes through at the combine in terms of being able to hit that speed mark. But I really just don't believe that this wide receiver free agency class is going to move the bar unless you find that one guy that you're absolutely head over heels for.
Yeah, I mean, I lean towards yes, but I think it's obviously a sliding scale based on the type of investment we're talking about, right? Like, are they going to be the team that pays $32 million for T Higgins? I don't know. We'll
No.
see, right? If it's like a baseline wide receiver too, like a Darius Slayton, for example, then I think that would that preclude them from drafting a receiver in round one? I kind of think it might, but I don't
Yeah.
know if it should necessarily. Ultimately, I think that they would probably prefer to grab a guy on day two if everything breaks the way that they kind of envision this offseason going. I know I wrote about Debo Samuel. It seems like he is going to be had for the very, very, very cheap, or he's just going to get flat out released. I think he could be an option for them. But even guys like that, like Slayton, Samuel, like those can't be your only investments this offseason. Like they have to go get more weaponry, even with those guys in the fold. But for me, a lot of it does depend on like what happens with George Pickens, right? Like they made a ton of changes last year in an effort to, I think, help his growth and development. They got rid of Deontay Johnson. They give him full autonomy over that X receiver position. They brought in a wide receivers coach who has kind of a reputation as being more of a stern, kind of hard nosed type of coach, right? But the results, they were pretty much the same, right? Like he's incredibly talented. We know that. We know the things that he could do in between the lines, but the lack of consistent effort was still there. The other stuff behind the scenes as well, like him showing up late, the meetings, the things like that, some of the stuff which isn't necessarily public knowledge right now. Entering the last year of his contract, who knows what happens there, right? Like I still lean towards like 55% that he plays out the season. I think it was like a 35% chance he gets traded. I only think there's like a 10% chance that he gets extended. I just think that that is a risk that I personally would feel like that is an absurd risk to take at this stage of the proceedings. I could be wrong. We'll see. That's just me reading the tea leaves and also like kind of a hint of what I would think that they should be doing as well. But if he's dealt like at any point, that leaves another significant void, right? In terms of you needing to make another high tiered investment, even if it's pretty understandable why you could envision them like kind of moving on from him. So I don't know. I do think that there is a world in which it kind of takes them out of the first round receiver, market, but I also think it just depends on the board, right? Like there's going to be, I think that there's going to be a defensive lineman there regardless that they may have ranked ahead of maybe any of these receivers that could be available at 21. So it's just my kind of opinion on how things sit as of today. But we got an interesting one here. It kind of goes like hand in hand with some of the other stuff we've kind of talked about, but it's from Connor. Would you hypothetically be okay with passing on a defensive lineman if you think the draft is deeper at that particular position, which it absolutely is, to say get a wide receiver in a more shallow pool, which I think that's the truth too, or do you just opt to kind of get your guys no matter what the context? You like this question, so I'm gonna let you kind of take the floor here.
So this is a huge one for me because I think it really depends on your type of team and obviously the type of asks that you ask your team. in the 2023 class, I was pretty big on the defensive line class. I also had some sleepers later in the class. Like I was a big Kobe Turner type of fan,
Big
but
hit, big
obviously,
hit.
like he ends up going in like the third round, ends up being like a steal. Even at that juncture, I'm pretty sure some people even expected him to go like a little later. Um, it really depends though if like that type of player fits your scheme, obviously, because like you don't want him being like a two gap like type of player consistently every down. I would say in terms of defensive linemen, in this class, I think there is a lot of merit to this potential risk because there are some guys that you go down the board, you say, oh yeah, I want a Darius Alexander in the second round as opposed to taking Mason Graham in the first, even though I might not like this offensive tackle class, for the Patriots. Like, let's say they
Yep.
want to because they're in a situation. I'm just going to kind of answer this from a Patriots perspective. If you're in a situation where you don't like the offensive tackle class, but like let's say there's risk and there's some guys that potentially, while they have some good film, there are some other questions that have to be solved. Like let's say Josh Simmons out of Ohio State. Like you think like that's like a first round type of talent, but you don't want to warrant, passing on a Mason Graham. I could definitely see, taking a Mason Graham in that situation, just taking the best available player. But if you per se just love some guy like later in the class, like a Darius Alexander or Riley Mills, and you just feel so comfortable about where you're going to get them that you can warrant that type of, that hedge. I definitely think you can take those types of risks in the first round as long as you make up for it later down the line. So for me, it depends on getting your guy. It also depends on just it's a case by case basis. You don't always want to play the depth of the positional game because you can sometimes go into a lot of unnecessary risks. Sometimes your guy does not always pan out. So you have to just kind of play it by ear. You have to understand, what type of prospect you really like in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, like there are wide receivers in this class that I'm just not that like huge on taking in the first round, but I'm not a fan of taking my guy later in the draft, to hedge that bit. So I
True.
might wait on defensive line later on. So I really think you play the prospect pool in this class, but it's a case by case basis.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. One of the things that I kind of some really good advice that I got, like I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, from someone that I really respect in the draft industry. He was telling me, grade and scout with conviction, and like that was one of the things for me that I really kind of needed to hear at the time because there's one particular prospect that I can remember. It was Justin Herbert, guy that I liked a lot, but was almost my like other people's perception of Herbert as a quarterback kind of clouded my own perception. And I started to hang on to like his weaknesses instead of hanging on to the things that I really liked.
I am
And
the
I didn't
same.
have him as high as I should have had. Now looking back on that, I feel like an idiot.
Yep.
But at the same time, I just think, I bring this up because I've watched a lot of like Walter Nolan. I'm just using him as an example. And I just think that there are going to be scouts in this class that look at Walter Nolan and the combination of power and quickness combined with like his youth and how like where he's at on his developmental path, and they will latch on to his highs, right? You can pull up pretty much any game that I've found from Ole Miss this past season
The
and
Florida one's
find two.
special.
Yeah, you could find 2 to 3 reps where he looks like the best player of this entire class. If I'm the Steelers and I'm a scout who meets with your front office members, and then you get the coaches involved, and you say like, this is the Cam Hayward, this is the replacement. Now they're not all like one-to-one comparison; they're very different players. But like, if you think that this guy is the anchor to your front for the next 8 to 10 years, if you have that type of conviction, you take that guy if he's available at 21. Like even with all that other stuff being said, that we like the depth of the class, right? So there are certain players that you will have a really strong conviction on that are no brainers in terms of like this dude there, he's taking them. We will not trade back. We will not pass on him no matter what. So there are always going to be exceptions to the rule, right? But I do like with what you're saying is there are times where you can go into a draft and say like, okay, well maybe we can play it a little bit differently. And I do think that that's what comes into it. I know everybody loves mock drafts, but NFL teams mock drafts too. They go through all these different scenarios in terms of, okay, who could be available? how could certain draft plays play out. And I've really enjoyed like hearing other people's perspectives on that in terms of the lead up to the draft. And it's going to be very interesting to see like how teams play, like not just the defensive tackle class, but also the running back class. That's another one, right? Running back's a little bit different, and I think I'll lean more towards maybe playing the depth game on positions like that aren't necessarily like premier position, because I do view like pass rushers. I don't necessarily view it as like just edge guys. Like I view it as pass rushers in general. That's a premium position to me. So like I'm maybe a little bit more hesitant to kind of play the depth. But that's a fantastic question, and one that I'm glad we were kind of able to answer, just to kind of give our viewpoints around where that kind of goes. But next question here. I forget who this one's from. I should have wrote it down, but I apologize. But how would you guys feel about the Steelers going interior offensive line in the second round of the draft? I'll take this one first, because this is something that I've kind of thrown around a little bit more recently over the past maybe 30 days or so since the season kind of concluded. I will preface this by saying just all these questions about, positional needs and things like that, all of this could be thrown completely out of the window after free agency, because we just don't really know exactly what the roster is going to look like heading into that, final weekend in April, right? So like just preface that. But we know the Steelers, they're going to look to improve the trenches. That's kind of the way they built this thing since Andy Whiteoff kind of came into the fold. But I do think that, you look at Seumalo, I think he took a small step back last year. He's also 32 with a lengthy injury history. I'm a little bit lower on Mason McCormick than I think the majority of people are, even though I really do want to continue to try and develop him. There are a couple of players that I think intrigue me. One of those guys is Wyatt Milam from West Virginia. I'm not sure if you've got to his tape yet, but he's played left tackle for them. He's probably going to kick inside at the next level. I'm almost sure of it. Despite being 6'6", like the dude's huge. But I think he's going to kick inside because of some like kind of redirect and recovery concerns. Independent hand usage in pass pro is awesome. He's got a real nice snatch trap move that he'll deploy. He's a really solid athlete. Dude, this dude's tape is all like reach blocks and body bags. Like this dude's getting people on the ground all the time. He can execute cut blocks. Awesome. He has this really unique ability to get to the second level and stay on balance, and also get his hands inside with really nice grip strength to sustain blocks throughout the rep. Really like those qualities about his game. He's got almost 3,000 career snaps in college, so this dude has plenty of experience. Granted, all of that has come at left tackle. I do have some optimism that he could play right away, depending on how he would handle the position switch. So depending on the board, yeah, like he's probably going to be a guy that's going to come in inside my top 50. So if he was there for them, I would feel really, really happy about getting him, next to Zach Frazier, and having those two Mountaineers kind of anchor my offensive line for the foreseeable future. I just think their offensive line's like extremely well coached. A lot of the things, even though they're different body types for sure, a lot of the things I liked about Frazier's game in terms of the physicality, the toughness, the technique, really carries over with Milam as well. Also, kind of shout out Gray Zabel. We talked about him as a Senior Bowl winner, right? He may end up being like the first center off the board. Granted, Pittsburgh doesn't need a center. He would play guard here, but I do think he's a good scheme fit for what the Steelers like to do. I'm not sure if you have any questions. Like, would interior offensive line even be a consideration for you on day 2?
I would say it'd be more of a consideration for me on early day 3, kind of where they've been addressing, where they addressed it with Mason McCormick, and then, years ago with Kevin Dotson. They've had a good bit of success in that regard. And a guy I have in mind is actually Luke Kandra out of Cincinnati.
Okay.
He doesn't have like insane foot speed, and he's not like the most versatile guy, but he's just so solid in terms of just being able to hold that point of attack. Like he's just an absolute wall in terms of being able to stand up to power, absolute menace in terms of just being physical, at the point of attack. And he's a guy who has had a really, solid climb. Like he started out during like the Hula Bowl, and he's kind of like made himself up and gotten a lot more buzz as time has gone on. He's definitely a guy that like he's more scheme limited, but he might make sense as like one of those guys that like you take later on and you feel good about like the returns, in terms of like, guys that you can rely on at offensive guard. Because I don't think guard is necessarily like a marquee position, but I also think it really depends on the type of guards that are available. It like years ago, it was David DeCastro. He fell to their
Yep.
lap. That's when you sprint to the podium and you run it up. I just don't think there's maybe that type of guard, except maybe Tyler Booker, as far as I'm concerned in this class. So I'm not really looking to address it on day 2, but I definitely am open to the idea based off my initial thoughts of it being like an early day 3 type of attack.
Yeah, I think like 2, I would be okay. I still think that there could be, granted, I'm not as far into the offensive line scouting in this class to where I haven't gotten to a ton of day 3 guys. There may be some day 3 guys that could come in and give McCormick some competition. And like that's kind of my thing is I think you do run a little bit of risk like going into next year. I love the youth of the Steelers offensive line, and I think they're heading in the right direction, and they better be considering how much they've invested up front, right? But I do think you run a little bit of a risk, like bringing in, saying like, okay, we're going to run this back with like Broderick Jones, Mason McCormick, because you're going to have to get significant steps from at least one of those guys to really be the offensive line that I think the front office and the coaching staff envisions. That's just a little bit of a scary proposition to me. But the last one here is from, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if you're worried about the prospect of Broderick Jones just not being the guy that they drafted him to be, realized at offensive tackle, and say you do have the questions about offensive guard, I think you go in like a direction day 2. Like you said, I think it actually does make sense in that regard. If you want to, like, if you're thinking about like the offensive tackle position, not just offensive guard, then I think it warrants it. So you go for like a guy like a Miles Frazier out of LSU, who kind of like showed that guard and tackle versatility with like a good build to like play both positions.
Good shot.
I think that's when you want to like, you know, take that day 2 investment if you're not exactly feeling comfortable about that high investment that you made in Broderick Jones.
Yeah, I know we got to move on, but like one other thing that I will say about that is like I kind of in my head have kind of already like penciled in them signing like a veteran tackle maybe for like the cheap. The thing about tackle that makes it so difficult, and the reason why it's a premium investment that you have to make in the draft, is like good starting tackles, they don't necessarily ever become available in free agency. This year is kind of unique in that perspective because a guy like Ronnie Stanley is going to hit free agency, but Stanley's had such a weird second contract in Baltimore. Like he's missed so much time, dealt with so many injuries, that he was finally healthy this past season, and then he's going to hit the open market on a nice contract. But it's really difficult to find good starters or above average starters at tackle in free agency. You usually have to draft those guys. So I could see them, doing what you're saying and going that route as well. Last question here is from Smooth. Have you guys looked into Trey Harris? Any thoughts on him since he's been picking up some steam recently? You have any thoughts on Trey Harris?
So Trey Harris is getting a lot of buzz from advanced analytics. They're looking at the yards per route run. And he's a yards per route run darling. And they're actually kind of ignoring like the age with him, which is actually super interesting. I found it to be, but watching Trey Harris, I've only watched like a couple of games like where I was fully paying attention to him, but I believe it was against Kentucky. I remember watching him run a blaze out route, and I've seen it on my timeline a couple times, and people have been impressed with it. I haven't
a couple times.
Yeah. I've seen it a couple times, but I've watched him run that route, and I was not as impressed as his ability to gear down, but I was impressed with his footwork in terms of being able to quickly get out of that break in terms of, making up for that lack of hip sync. But he's a guy who can really attack the catch point. He's physical after the catch. And those are the types of receivers that will definitely interest Pittsburgh. The issue's going to be the age, I would say, but I think it's more warranted to take a risk if like the advanced analytics are also looking good and then you'd like what you see on tape. Obviously, you run the risk of the Ole Miss system where, again, they got all that space. It doesn't just apply to the the quarterback. It applies to the receivers too in terms of what they're being asked to run in terms of actual routes. And one play in particular, this kind of showed me his awareness. It was a cover 4 look. The corner is like both the corner and the safety are basically squatting underneath. He's running an in breaker, and he's like, okay, No, they're sitting on this. He ends up running it upfield, but Dart already moved his eyes off of it. And I was like, I was impressed with his awareness to be able to adjust on the fly to see that type of leverage and you figure out where the weakness was. Because I've seen a lot of receivers, they don't really attack towards space. They're consistently just kind of running their route, and then they sometimes just go into that neighboring leverage. So I'm impressed a little bit what I've seen from Trey Harris, but in terms of my full thoughts on him, you'll have to wait a little bit longer on that.
Yeah, I think there's some deceptive route running to Harris that maybe you wouldn't expect from a guy that's like 6'2", like 210 pounds. So he has pretty good size. I like his physicality, his ability to play through contact in the route, his ability to like win the jump ball. He made some really nice contested catch opportunities this past season. He was like having a super productive season before he ended up getting banged up. He missed several games, I think, with some sort of injury in the later part of like the schedule once they got into like more of the SEC play. But there's definitely some stuff to like with Harris. I do have some of the same concerns, like in terms of he wasn't asked to do like a lot in terms of like pure route running. Like the route running tree is like relatively limited. You mentioned the blaze out, like the one clip against Kentucky that everybody talks about against Maxwell Harrison, but he also had like another similar one against Vandy. It was on the left side of the field. It looks the exact same. But I do think that Harris is going to be one of those players that, if you were to kind of wait until like the third round or something like that to grab like somebody that can play the X for you, I think that Harris makes some sort of sense there. But I do think that there's, for an older prospect, like he does still need a decent amount of seasoning. And that's like one of the things that I think that you kind of are a little bit worried about. I don't think like the straight line speed is ever going to make him like this true burner once he gets up against like better competition. But I do think like he could be like a solid role player at the next level. I don't necessarily think of like, I know I've seen the same charts that you do, man. Like people love those like yards per route run stats and stuff in college, and they like, so I like production is definitely like, it's a very important part of an evaluation, but it's not everything, and there's these players are operating in very different ecosystems, and it's just important to keep that kind of in the back of your mind. Those counting statistics and everything don't really do it for me. But anyways, we ran long per usual, but we do really appreciate the continued support, not just on the channel, but in terms of this podcast in general. Just on your way out, if you haven't already, let us know what you thought of the episode. Any questions that you guys have, drop those in the comments, drop us a like, make sure you're subscribed, hit that bell, everything else. And Nick and I will be back next Monday, right before I leave for Indianapolis and the NFL Combine. So I'm really excited about that. We will check you guys next week. Peace and love.